Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Getting Stuck and Unstuck. I'm Pat Loader, the Executive Director of the Compassionate Friends. Before we begin the webinar, let me mention that all attendees are muted. In order to ask a question, please type your question into the question pane located on your screen's control panel. We will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. Our presenter this evening is Vicki Scalzitti, who is the Manager of Children's Bereavement Services for Rainbow Hospice and Palliative Care in Mount Prospect, Illinois. Vicki began working with bereaved families after the accidental death of her darling 5-year-old son, Joey, in 1989. She attended the Compassionate Friends chapter, Northwest Suburban, for a number of years and continues to stay connected to her TCF friends at the national conferences each year. Since 1990, Vicki has worked with grieving children and adults, providing consultation, support groups, and family camps. She is an accredited school crisis trauma specialist, and she regularly presents on families in grief to schools, community organizations, and conferences in the local, regional, and national levels. Vicki recently co-authored a book, 10 Steps for Parenting Your Grieving Children. However, the most important thing to know about Vicki is that she is today and always Joey's loving mommy. Welcome, Vicki.
Thank you, Pat. I'm grateful for this opportunity and glad to be connecting with my TCF friends this way. And I just want to say, Pat, do I have control?
Yes, you do.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you besides to Compassionate Friends, but also to my employer, Rainbow Hospice and Palliative Care, for their support of this webinar, and to my colleagues who've come tonight and providing an audience. I'm very grateful to them. So perhaps some of you can identify with that. Perhaps some of us have been there and felt that. Or this. You know, I think that the idea of feeling stuck is something that's kind of universal for bereaved parents, at least at some point or another in their journey. Pat, I think that we're going to start with a poll, and I think that you have control of that poll. Am I right?
I sure do.
Okay. The question is, could we find out how many people joining us tonight can identify with feeling stuck at some point in their grief experience?
And if the audience would just click on yes or no, we'll close the poll in a few minutes and then see the results.
Thanks, Pat. You know, when bereaved parents talk to each other, I think that we have a shorthand we kind of use. I think there are things that between us that we've just come to believe from our experience. One of those things is that we understand each other better than other people understand us. And I think to some degree that's probably true. When we talk, we don't have to explain things to each other. You feel what I feel, and you know what I mean. But as my time with grieving parents has gone on, and I've met with, worked with, and journeyed with others of us, I've started to wonder about assumptions of any kind. So for a moment, I'd like to explore this a bit. I think it has a lot to do with how we communicate with each other. We understand each other better than other people understand us. It has been my experience that people will understand or not about as much as they'll risk. Let's face it, the experience of losing a child to death is perhaps the most soul-searing, frightening, and desperate experience that humans endure. At least it felt like that for me. And a lot of people who haven't had to endure it don't even want to look at it, let alone think about it or let the possibility into their consciousness. And those people, and perhaps most of us have had some of those folks in our lives, won't ever understand. But I have found that I can get help and support from people who will do three things for me. First, to listen to what I have to say. The next is to believe what I have to say. And the last is to respect what I have to say. Listening means being willing to be present. To believe what I have to say means to listen without trying to change my view or my perspective of my experience. No cliches, and no trying to convince me that it's really not that bad or there's a bright side to be looking on. And respecting what I say in my experience means to trust that I am moving through this experience in the best way that I can, and to believe that I will find my way. When people do that, whether they're bereaved parents or not, I think they can make a big difference in our lives. When we talk, we don't have to explain things to each other. Bereaved parents, particularly at Compassionate Friends, do a lot of affirming of each other for sure. We do a lot of head nodding, eye contact, hand holding, back patting, and hugging. When we talk about loss at Compassionate Friends, we're not alone. We feel heard and we feel understood. But I've also seen people, and I've done this myself, who felt exactly the opposite of what a person is saying, but who were just as kind, understanding, and supportive, even though they didn't really know what the other parent was talking about. Because experienced bereaved parents know that it really doesn't matter so much that we're different. The important thing to understand is that it's our child's death that has changed us in countless cataclysmic and infinitesimal ways. We make an effort to accept what another person is saying for sure, although sometimes we realize that we may not understand what the person is describing, and that's kind of the second point. When someone listens, it doesn't always mean that the words you're using mean the same thing to both of you. You feel what I feel. We may have a lot of the same feelings for sure. But more importantly, the second statement on the slide is also accurate. When another bereaved parent tells you things are going badly or that they're feeling awful or that this sucks, it can be very different than what that means to you. What feelings are bad or difficult for one person are sometimes tolerable for someone else. Some people hate feeling lethargic. When I lost Joey and when I was grieving him every single day and in the trenches of my deepest grief, I hated that feeling of exhaustion and that feeling of kind of being paralyzed. While some people hate feeling lethargic like I did, some of us hand ourselves over to that and just cocoon and do pretty well with it. Some bereaved parents are frightened by their own anger and rage, and some of us will enthusiastically go off and tear up the lawn, demolish the guest bath, throw things, or yell at the next extraordinarily insensitive person who darkens our path. Some of us will lose our minds when we try to sort out this experience, and others of us can't stop reading and contemplating. The point is, we all have different aspects of the grief experience that are the most difficult to weather, and the same things don't provide for relief for all of us as well. It's great to have a good cry, but some bereaved parents do not feel better after they cry. They just don't. So when a bereaved parent tells me that they are bad or that things are going badly, I've learned to ask, what kind of bad? Or what does it feel like for you now? Sometimes I've asked, what were you hoping things would be like by now? I never assume that I understand what's going on with that other person because, as it turns out, for all we have in common, our grief journey is pretty personal after all. You know what I mean. We often use very different words to describe our feelings and our experiences. And a great example of this came, where else, for me, at Compassionate Friends. About 2 years into my experience, my own grief experience, I was at my local chapter meeting, and people started talking about feeling and being stuck. Everybody was in the discussion, everybody absolutely in the group. It struck a chord that evening. Brand new members were talking about it, experienced grievers were talking about it, and some very long-term grievers who facilitated the meeting joined in as well. The thing that was interesting to me is that people weren't talking about when they were stuck. They were talking about feeling stuck right then, all of them. So later that night, through the next few days, I found myself thinking about the meeting and wondering how so many bereaved parents at so many different stages of the grief journey and describing very different experiences all identified with being stuck. And 2 years later, I sat in that same room and gave a presentation about stuck and what I'd come to understand about what stuck means to grieving parents. I guess like everyone else, I can't talk about grief without talking about where we are on the journey, recognizing that time changes many things, but not all things. When I began to think about stuck, I realized that timing seemed to have something to do with the experience. So please be patient while I just take a few minutes to talk about models of grief. The first thing to know is that grief has 5 steps. Or is it 4? Or is it 7? In my notes, it says 12. Okay, I'm being a little silly here. I don't believe in sequential steps, though. But what I do believe is that things change over time, and that sometimes they change back. So here is Dr. Kubler-Ross's very famous model of grief. The first thing to know, though, is that she didn't develop this to describe grieving a death. She developed this to describe the process of coming to terms with one's own impending death. But here's what we did learn from Dr. Kubler-Ross, and we owe her big time for this. She's the one who let us know that grief is not one thing, that it's not just sadness. Until she described it this way, people believed that grief meant sadness and that other feelings and expressions were pathological, that bargaining or feeling guilty, that anger or rage, that hopelessness or helplessness were evidence of a flawed and abnormal response. So, as I said, we owe her big time. But if grief is in steps, to me, the steps are probably more like this. William Worden developed a task-based model to look at grieving. He talked about things that we have to accomplish, things that we have to come to terms with. Tasks, not sequential steps, and also tasks that are in process and continuing throughout the grief experience, not one after another, but sometimes all going on simultaneously. These seem useful and descriptive to me, and there's a certain comfort of being able to define our experience. So we need to accept the reality of loss. We need to hand ourselves over to the pain of this experience and go into it and through it. We need to adjust to a world where our loved one isn't here. And we learn to adjust our lives to all the ways that that person is missing. Finally, to emotionally relocate the person, to come into a relationship with that loved one, and then reinvest in life. The only problem with this list is that parental grief seemed to me to be a lot wilder, untamed, and messier than this description. But perhaps that's only really a difference in my perception. For me, I eventually came to view my grief as a whirlpool. At the bottom and at the very beginning, I felt propelled from one profoundly painful moment to the next. I was in turns angry, frustrated, guilt-ridden, despairing, yearning for him, and inconsolable, with a feeling that there wasn't even a moment to catch my breath. As time went on, it seemed like I was moving up the whirlpool a little. There was a bit more light and the pace was slower. I was still feeling all the things I'd felt, but with a little more space to breathe between the onslaught. In addition, other feelings and experiences were showing up and creeping in. Moments of peace, of love for Joe that weren't bracketed by pain, and appreciation for the support I was receiving. The moments of concern for others, in my case, particularly kids who were walking this road. I still describe my grief as a whirlpool because even after 22 years, I don't feel finished. I don't think I'll get finished with grief, or the grief will be finished with me. I can still feel angry about Joey's death, sad, frustrated, or tired from it. But most of my days are spent loving and remembering him, not lost in sadness. You see, after 22 years, I can dog paddle my way around the top of the whirlpool pretty effectively. So this, I think, is the most important thing to know about grief. That grief is a personal transformative journey that never leaves you where it found you. Since tonight I'd like to talk about the experience of feeling stuck, however, I wanted to use some designations to describe points on the grief journey. The above designations are entirely mine, and I take full responsibility for them. And let me be clear again, these are not steps that we consciously aim ourselves at or move through. They're just a way of describing points on the grief journey that some of us might recognize or identify with. And it will take each of us our own time and experience to get to these different points. There's no clock, no timetable, and no calendar associated with grief. Fresh grief. This is grief in the beginning. During earthquake days and nights, we feel shaken, as though things are collapsing around us. We feel like we can't find solid ground on which to plant a foot and take a step. We are ambushed by grief, overtaken by it, and our responses are mostly defensive. We're not taking grief by the horns. Grief's taken us. These are the days and weeks and months when we try to resist this experience. Perhaps almost all of us at TCFS have said this, but I know we've all heard it. Somebody came in and said, "I don't want to be part of your club." This is the time when we don't want to identify with others who are part of that club. We are still in rebellion, trying to hold grief at arm's length. We don't recognize ourselves, our families, our lives, or the world as we knew it. We are, to quote a prominent writer, strangers in a strange land. The next point, I think, is career grief. It seems that grief at this point is what we do for a living. People want to know what we're doing with ourselves, and we don't have an answer, although we are occupied and exhausted almost all the time. We aren't shocked by our feelings anymore. If anything, the experience is becoming monotonous. At moments, we are overtaken by sadness, as though we just heard that our child has died. Most of the time, we feel like we've been grieving like this forever. Grief defines our identity now. It is what I am and what I do. Hopefully, this is a temporary identity for us, but it doesn't feel that way. Sorry, folks, I missed moving on. Adjusted grief. At this point, other people begin to feel more comfortable with us. We seem more normal to them. We have accommodated and accepted grief. not the death of our child. But most people can't tell the difference between those two things. Other things begin to happen in our lives, and we're participating and experiencing them. In other words, other things are coming alongside. We are becoming comfortable with who we have become, and most days we feel like we can live the life we have. We're coming into the understanding that this is the new me, and this is my new normal. And lifelong grief. While grief can still overwhelm us at a particular moment, its strength, duration, and intensity are less in the everyday sense. Therefore, things are, in fact, better. This doesn't mean that the feelings associated with grief, when they overtake us, don't still feel like too much. But the world begins to seem benevolent again, or at least kind of neutral to us. And we can acknowledge moments of joy and hope and meaning. When we look carefully and thoughtfully at ourselves, we can see that while parts of us were lost through this experience, we are also, in some ways, more than we were. Stronger, more compassionate, more willing to go into a difficult situation and help. One warning, however, about this long-term view. No matter how we change or what we gain, it is never enough to balance out to the loss of our child. I've learned a lot since Joey died, and I know a lot of other bereaved parents who have as well. And not one of us wouldn't go back and take our child over anything else any day. But the truth is that I have stopped thinking about weighing those things against each other. I take what I've learned and become because out of the soul-searing experience of losing Joey, that's what I've gotten. If I don't take that, I haven't gotten anything. Pat, I think it's, we were going to report perhaps on the last poll and take a new one.
Sure will. Here's the results of our last poll. 91% of the people said that at some point they have experienced or have been stuck in their grief, while 9% have not.
So it's not, not quite universal, huh, Pat?
Correct.
Almost, but not quite. The next poll, do you have that up? The poll to see who thinks they're in fresh grief, who's in career grief, who's an adjusted griever, and who's in the lifelong category.
Give it a few more seconds and then I'll close the poll for you. Okay. We'll close it.
There are experiences of feeling stuck, to me, that seem more associated with one stage of grief than another. And that's one of the things that I found when I was thinking about this and when I was talking to folks about this. In fresh grief, I think the feeling we have is that I'm stuck with this reality. My child is dead and this is forever and it can never change. I had a really dear friend, Kay, who talked to me after Joey died about her experience. She was 22 years old and she had just given birth to her second and third child, twin girls. And the girls came prematurely, and in the early 60s when this happened to Kay, it was much more complicated than it can be today. And one of her daughters lived only a few hours. And Kay was talking about being in the bathroom at the hospital and dressing herself because she was going right from her hospital room to her daughter's funeral. And she said to me, Vicki, I looked into the mirror and I looked at myself and thought, this is the first thing in my life that will never change. I will always be the mother of 3 children, and one of my children will always be dead. And I stood there at 22 thinking, how could that be real? How could something have happened in my life that can't ever change? But actually, with this realization comes forward movement, even though stuck might be what we feel. When we're going through this, we come out of shock and denial and we enter the grief process. And even though feeling this is hard and painful, it's not a bad thing. It's really a first step. The grief journey is kind of ironic in this way. Grief contains the seeds of its own healing, and the more fully we let ourselves go into the experience, the more fully we get our lives back. So we have to start somewhere, and I think this is the first step. What to do to get through, though? Connect with others. I think that's really important. Connecting can involve the compassionate friends available to almost all of us now through face-to-face or virtual grief support like this evening. It helps to connect with other bereaved parents, and perhaps some who are long-time survivors of their child's death. Some of us can make connections with others through reading their stories or poetry, like in the newsletter, or listening to their music. And don't overlook the possibility that there might be a bereaved parent in your circle, maybe someone you never talked to about their experience, who might be willing to talk to you now. My friend Kay, who I talked about earlier, was a work friend, and we had never really talked about the loss of her daughter until she read about Joey in the paper and called. Another bereaved mom, who is a friend of mine, told me that she had never talked to her own mother about the loss of her son, my friend's own brother, until she lost her son. Another friend of mine said that a neighbor showed up after the death of her daughter. Her neighbor showed up with cookies and the story of her daughter's death while being anesthetized at the dentist's office. You see, bereaved parents are everywhere, and some of them have been quiet and solitary over many years. Cry, talk, sleep, knit, eat chocolate, watch reality shows, do anything that helps you get through each difficult moment of each difficult day. But monitor your choices and behavior, particularly about drugs and alcohol. And if it's starting to feel overwhelming, you might want to consider professional assistance and support. Pat, do we have results from the survey, from the poll?
Yes, we do. Let me share them with you. Pretty even across the board.
Wow. So we've got about close to 25% in each of those categories?
Pretty close.
Okay. So we're a pretty diverse group tonight for all bereaved parents, at least in where we are in this journey. Pat, is there a time at which you'd like to ask a question, or you'd like to forward a question to me?
That's up to you, Vicki, whenever you're ready.
Well, this might be a point where we could take a question to get folks involved.
Okay. This question is from Tammy, and she says, today is the 3rd anniversary of the death of her husband Nathan and her oldest son Jared. They were both killed together by a drunk driver. One of the hardest things for me and my now only son Justin is figuring out how to deal with the loss of both of them. Between us, we lost a husband, father, son, and brother. We have been to 3 different therapists and now have little, if no, experience in dealing with multiple losses. So my son came up with the idea that he would grieve for my husband, his dad, and I would grieve for my son, his brother, and between the two of us, they would both be grieved for equally. Not sure this is working so well, but it's all we have been able to figure out. I find myself grieving way more for my son as his death has just devastated me more so than my husband's, but feel guilty at the same time for not grieving equally. I have searched for books to read and have not found any that deal with this kind of loss. Everything I have read and gained from therapy deals with one-person relationship at a time. So I guess my question is, what kind of advice could you give me on dealing with multiple losses? I find it very difficult, if not impossible, to grieve for two people at the same time. Today, my son and I are in a very stuck place in our grieving process. Have a question or answer for that, Vicki?
Well, I'll take a run at it, Pat. First, my deepest sympathies on what has happened to your family, to both you and your son. And you are absolutely right. It's hard enough to find a professional in the counseling field who is really knowledgeable or helpful about loss, let alone multiple loss issues. Since you asked specifically about books, I do have a couple of resources to point you toward, and I hope it won't sound self-serving, but I'm the co-author of one of them. In the book 10 Steps for Parenting Your Grieving Children, Dr. Ann Berenberg, my co-author, and I wrote a chapter specifically on dealing with multiple losses. Ann and her husband, Jack Kane, co-authored a book entitled Now, Overcoming Crushing Grief by Living in the Present. And Jack wrote that book after losing his wife and two of his 3 children in a 20-month period. Both books are available on Amazon.com. So for resources or what somebody could read, at least I know that those books have some information on multiple loss issues. But I have some ideas too. First, although your son's idea of grieving one death while you grieve the other might ensure that both your son and husband are grieved equally, grieving is not really something we do for those we've loved and lost. It's something we do for ourselves. Because grief is the process we go through to find our way through these painful experiences and into a new and different life from the one we had cherished and counted on being forever. I think you'll find that both of you lost both of them, and you'll both have to grieve both of them. Second, there is no law saying how much grief we should or do feel. And while we do grieve because we love, it doesn't mean that someone we grieve the most is necessarily the one we love the most. As spouses and parents, we love our spouses and children differently, and we never have to apologize for that. Most of us understand, as spouses, that one day we will probably say goodbye to each other. And that's what usually happens when a marriage makes it to the finish line. But none of us are prepared for the death of our child. We're not wired to survive our kids, so that loss may feel more cataclysmic and overwhelming than the loss of a spouse. It's not about how much you love someone, so please don't add that to the burden of grief that you're carrying right now. It's fine that the death means something different to you and your son. You know, we don't just grieve a person, we grieve our unique personal relationship with them. And all our relationships are different. Just so you know, a lot of spouses are startled and disappointed to find out how differently they're grieving their child. And that's because they're grieving those different relationships. And also, of course, because we all grieve differently. As far as how to grieve more than one death, this answer can sound a little artificial or made up, but it's to find a way to give each death and grief its due. Perhaps you could attend Compassionate Friends to help with the loss of your son, and then attend a spousal loss group at church or at a community mental health center. Perhaps you could find days that you and your surviving son together can dedicate to the memory of your husband, father, and other special days that you dedicate to your son, brother. Maybe using their birthdays or times around each of their favorite holidays. Somehow, and even if it feels a little contrived right now, we do have to grieve our losses one at a time. Without doing that, it's like falling into a swamp of grief that just keeps pulling us down. Another idea might be to find separate friends to support each of your losses. One who helps the most about the loss of your husband, and one who's dedicated to helping you through the loss of your son. I hope this helps, that at least that's some groundwork. And again, I think you might find Jack's book now, Overcoming Crushing Grief by Living in the Present, helpful. He provides some really practical and helpful ways to begin moving into and through the grief process. And I wish both you and your son much deserved peace and hope for the future. So that's what I have for that question, Pat.
Okay.
We go back to the...
Would you like another question, or would you like to continue with your presentation?
Maybe we'll continue a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. The next step is career grief. And this everyday reality is tedious without end. I have never been so stuck for so long. In career grief, the familiarity of grief makes the experience feel more static. Moving from one feeling to another doesn't seem very different anymore because it's all achingly anticipated and familiar. We know what's coming, and the monotony of it wears on us. This is actually a risky time in the journey, the time when complicated grief is more likely to take hold. So some ideas about how to get through? Well, how about being patient with yourself and maintaining connections with those who will be patient with you? Even though at some points you can be sick of yourself in this time, don't retreat into yourself. Try to resist that. You can become an expert in your own grief by paying attention and becoming feeling savvy. For example, paying attention to specifically what kind of bad you're feeling and what triggers it. You know, normal grief is tidal in nature. It comes in and it goes out. And it's also a lot of different feelings. And it's important that grief continues to move. If you really feel like you're stuck, that you're feeling exactly the same, or that you'll go crazy if you have to feel, fill in the blank, one more minute or one more day, I had a strategy that helped me. Remember how I said I hated that lethargic, exhausted feeling? Well, one of the things I noticed was I had a friend, and her name was Helen. Rest in peace. But Helen had the capacity to infuriate me. When she talked about anything that was going on in my life, she almost always made me angry. Now, it's embarrassing to admit it, but I figured out how to make Helen help me, and this was it. When I was so lethargic and I couldn't move anymore and I couldn't get myself going, I used to give Helen a call so she'd make me mad. And you know what? Being mad relieved the lethargy and the inability to move and the paralysis. Now, you see, I'm not philosophically opposed to trying to give yourself a break in grief and kind of increase your emotional stamina. But I can't be Pollyanna about that. I wasn't in a place where I could go from my bad feeling to a good feeling. What I decided was it made more sense just to go from one bad feeling to a different bad feeling. But at least it was a break. And at least I felt like I was moving again. So the reverse was true, too. If I was really riled up and frustrated and angry, the place I could go to get in touch with deep sadness was the cemetery. And I could always count on calming myself down there. I would be very sad, but I would be much less agitated. So I found ways to pay attention to what triggered me and ways to use those things to actually kind of move myself into experiences and move myself out of experiences that I couldn't stand having anymore. You can think about keeping a feelings journal or a calendar. And chances are, if you do that, you'll discover that things aren't always the same. You may even discover that moments of lightning are beginning to occur to you when you really feel that weight lift off you for, even if it's just moments. I'd like to talk, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about complicated grief, though, which I think of as being clinically stuck. But I think before we do that, we had one more poll this evening. And Pat, can you take control of this?
Sure can.
The poll is, Okay, thanks. How many of you have made a conscious effort at some time to deliberately alter what you're feeling? Whether that was to accommodate other people, maybe to be less vulnerable, because you couldn't stand yourself, or because you didn't approve of your own feelings. Does anybody, how many have made a conscious effort to try and change what they're feeling? Is the poll up, Pat?
It sure is.
Great. Maybe we'll go on and talk a little bit about clinically stuck and then go back to the poll, get to the results.
All
Does that sound
right.
okay?
That sounds great.
Thank you. Sometimes, in fact, we might need help as bereaved parents or as grievers. For some of us, grief becomes complicated or could trigger a clinical depression. If this happens, this depression does not usually resolve without medical or therapeutic intervention. So how can you tell if you or someone you care about is experiencing complicated grief? Well, the griever feels isolated and alone because he or she cannot receive or feel support, even when it's offered. If you're trying to help someone like this, you feel like you've encountered a glass wall and can't figure out why your words and actions have no impact. Nothing seems to get through. The griever is experiencing a loss of self-esteem. They express being no good for anyone or anything. They express being helpless and incompetent. The griever is experiencing psychosomatic illness, and psychosomatic illness is not all in the head. Psychosomatic illness is an actual illness that has its beginning in emotional upheaval. So grievers who are sick or symptomatic need medical assistance. Not an okay thing to ignore because it does not usually resolve on its own. And finally, complicated grief is kind of the definition of stuck. In complicated grief, there's no movement, and the person usually sounds, like when we say a broken record. They obsessively repeat the same story, or they report always being in the same place emotionally. So when you see them on Monday, they're angry and rage-filled, and when you see them on Wednesday, they're angry and rage-filled, and when you see them on Saturday, they're angry and rage-filled. And grief isn't in its kind of normal tidal movement of coming in and out and being different. Grief becomes extraordinarily stuck and static and all one thing. So how to get help if you think that's happened to you or to somebody that you love? Well, the first thing is usually to start with a complete physical exam, and perhaps then specifically for anybody who's experiencing physical symptoms. Ask for referrals or information from other grieving parents. So compassionate friends, your friends of compassionate friends might know someone who's been helpful to someone in your community. You can utilize trusted clergy, employee assistance programs, community mental health centers, or human services programs as well. And then you can also look for groups that are associated with your child's illness or cause of death. Sometimes those folks have some real connections to people who can be of help. When seeking professional assistance, though, choose someone who has extensive experience in loss issues if you can. It makes a big difference. When anyone, yourself, a person who knows and loves you, even a mental health professional, is looking at you and evaluating how you're doing, it's important to take into consideration that grievers have a different baseline for their emotional experiences. In other words, we can't expect the bereaved to be like other people. Bereaved people live with an undercurrent of sadness that might mean depression in others. But bereaved people can fall into a clinical depression as well. So it's important that someone who is evaluating you as a bereaved parent have some sense of what's likely to be true for and about you in this experience. Pat, do we have the results from the survey?
Yes, we do. We're sharing them now.
Okay.
Almost half of the people did so because they were accommodating other people. 16% because they wanted to appear less vulnerable, and 30% just couldn't stand what they were feeling, and only 5% because they didn't approve of their own feelings.
Well, at least that last figure is good to know. So most of us, if we have done that to ourselves, did it for what we thought was a purpose other than just kind of picking on ourselves. And if we've done that and picked on ourselves, I think that can certainly understand. Like I said, I remember those days when I was kind of sick of myself. But I hope that most of us move toward a whole lot more self-acceptance through this process, because we need it. We need patience with ourselves. You know, it's interesting. You can hear from that result that so many of us will do something for other people. We should, you know, I've often thought, do we extend the same acceptance to ourselves that you know, as the effort we'll put out there to make it okay for someone else. So. The next stage I wanted to talk about was adjusted grief. It's been blank years since my child's death, and things really don't change much anymore. I guess this is what I'm stuck with, how it's always going to be. What to do to get through. You know, when Joey, about 3 years after Joey's death, I got invited to a church to speak to a grief ministry. And so I was saying, on the way out to this church, my husband Bill and I were in the car, and Bill said to me, at 3 years, I'm not surprised that I miss him, meaning Joey, every day. I'm surprised, though, at how much of my life I got back. And when I got to the church, I was talking to folks, and I heard myself say, it's been 3 years, and things don't seem to be changing very much. The one thing is, it's not great, but I can live this life I have now. And after I got done speaking, a rather elderly lady came up to me, and she took my face in her hand, and she said to me, sweetheart, I lost my daughter when she was 16 years old, and that was 33 years ago. And 33 years is better than 3. She also didn't say it was finished. And that it was always, it sounds like an apocryphal story, but I'm not making that up. So if 33 years is better than 3, then here's what we can know. Change may be subtle, but it's probably still happening. And I can tell you from my experience, I think that that's true. One of the things we could do is take an inventory of all the things that you do now and that are part of your life that might have once seemed impossible to you. Think about reaching out, or do it. You know, it's a powerful way of shifting our view of ourselves from having been the victim of our child's death to being a survivor of it. The quick way to do that is finding out how much we have to offer others. And at the bottom, celebrate your survival. You know, celebrating doesn't necessarily mean throwing a party. It could be taking up yoga, a new wardrobe with less black, a vacation, an adventure, redoing a room in your home. Just something that says, I held on and came through this. And I'm different, but I'm okay. And finally, lifelong grief. I've survived the death of my child. I have a life that I feel I can actually live well day to day, but I feel stuck. Some things in my life just don't fit me anymore. For lifelong grievers, I call this the transformative stuck. It occurs when we feel the need to create a new reality out of the life-changing experience of loss. So maybe this slide is not really about getting through. Maybe this slide is really about how to respond. The first thing is to accept that you, your relationships, your priorities, and your way of seeing the world have changed. Realize that others, even people who love and care for you, have not gone through the sea change you have. And when it comes to spouses, I said even spouses, but maybe I should have said especially spouses will not change in exactly the same way. You have been grieving the same child, but you were and are grieving different relationships with that child. You know, we all wind up kind of on our own journey. And I remember somebody saying to me, or hearing this joke one time, that somebody said on her 60th birthday, my grandmother started walking 5 miles a day. And then the person that they were talking to said, wow, that's great, that's really good for you. And they said, yeah, but we don't know where the heck she is. You know, I think one of the problems here is that when we're on those different roads, it can be hard to figure out as a couple how to get back together and how to reconnect. But I think if you wound up in very different places, try to remember that you meant something to each other before you were bereaved parents. And you might have to work a little bit to rediscover what that was. You can follow some of the practical steps from the last stage. It makes perfect sense that you experience a strong need to make something come out of your child's life and death, something that reflects both his or her importance and your own survival. For some of us, this has involved redoing and restructuring our lives. A lot of bereaved parents have established philanthropy in their kids' names, worked on legislation, changed careers, or gone back to school. But there are smaller things we can do as well. And you know, retirement can be an opportunity to turn your attention to different things and to helping in different ways without having to overturn the whole apple cart of your life. So sometimes this transformation in us can kind of meld with other transformations or other changes in our life. Some parents turn around and go right back into the fire, helping parents and families affected by the disease or disorder that took their child's life. And that's remarkable, and that's an amazing gift. Some folks coach or mentor kids or work in their faith communities, religious education, baptism, wedding, or bereavement ministries. You know, there are many opportunities to help in memory of your precious child when the time is right. Acknowledge, finally, that it is possible to live long and well, and that we honor our children by our own courage and compassion. While I still work every day to answer this question, I know what a memorial to Joseph Peter Scalzitti could never be. It couldn't be the broken pieces of my ruined life. He was too wonderful, too amazing, and too beautiful for that. And I have a right to a life that is more than that, more than mired in resentment, more than stuck on an emotional roller coaster, more than lost in depression, and more than constrained in a life that doesn't fit me anymore. And so do you. Perhaps some of you know her. This is the Christmas box angel. She's a statue that now resides in a number of cemeteries across the country. She stands in memory of children lost too soon. What I love about her is that her eyes are upturned and her arms are open. I like to think open to hope. Being stuck means more than one thing, and it may mean different things at different stages of our grief experience. Stuck can be a fact you have to contend with early on, and ironically, the first step into coping with your new reality. Emotionally, being stuck can occur at any passage in the journey. Being stuck can become a clinical issue if you're overwhelmed and overtaken by grief. And in the context of your entire life, the feeling of being stuck can be the impetus for transformation. Stuck can be a position we get ourselves into or simply find ourselves in. Stuck can sneak up on us, feel familiar or comfortable until we realize that finding our way back out may not be so easy. Stuck can be a solitary experience, or it might mean calling out all the troops to help you get moving again. Stuck is difficult, maybe painful and frustrating, but it can also be what we're feeling in the moment before we shake ourselves free and take the next step towards hope. So Pat, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question from the audience, if I can, Vicki.
I'd love to see if we can answer that.
Okay, this is from Pam, and she asked if it's normal to feel distance towards the child that is living. I will only allow him to get so close, then I push him away because I want my other child back.
Well, Pat, for me, I realized something about that, and I really identify with that caller's feeling. I think that it's about two things when that happens. One is that I sometimes thought of grief for myself as a wall that came up, and that I was on one side of that brick wall and everything else was on the other side of the brick wall. And I was on one side with my grief, and on the other side of the wall were all my other feelings, emotions, connections, people that I responded to, and that in fact, grief and me were constant companions. We were on this one side of the wall, and I couldn't seem to reach through that. I couldn't seem to feel much of anything besides the grief. And so as parents, while this very often induces guilt or makes us feel badly about ourselves, I think this is part of the process. And I think that the wall does come down, and I think it comes down one brick at a time and at the right time. The second thing is, I think that sometimes the pain of this just makes us afraid to engage, to almost be afraid to be fully in relationship, especially with our surviving kids. It's just so hard. I think it's that feeling, that realization of how searing and painful this can be, something that we don't, we probably didn't let into our consciousness either. So, I think both of those things operate. And one of the things that I learned was that sometimes I just had to kind of fake it till I could make it. Mother the best way that I knew how, even if I felt kind of empty when I was doing it, and take some time to not beat up on myself and to ask other people to listen to me about this and to not judge me and to give me support. What I can tell you is that for me it was about 14 months that after Joey died that I went and picked Billy up at school. And he was a pretty little guy, 9 years old. And I picked him up and I took him out of school. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I came to take you to lunch." And he said, "I just ate lunch." And I said, "I know, but I'm going to spend the day with you anyway." And he looked at me and I said, "I'm back." And he said, "Well, that's good." And at 9 years old, he even knew what I meant. So I have to say that I think is a real common experience, and one that I hope that the person who asked that question will just be very patient with herself.
Great advice. I think that's all that we have time for tonight, Vicki. I thank you so much for doing this webinar for us. You had some great advice, and thank you so very, very much.
Pat, thanks for letting me be with you, and thanks to Compassionate Friends for all the help they've been in my life.
Good night.
Good night.